And we're on.
Well, welcome everyone, our listeners and viewers from around the world for the next episode of Conversations about COVID-19 plus more with my colleagues from McGill's Office for Science and Society, Jonathan Jerry, who has a background in molecular biology. We have Ada McBean, who is a recent graduate in chemistry, and monitoring everything behind the scenes and making sure everything goes right is Emily Shore. And a very special guest today. Let me introduce you to Dr. Paul Offit. Paul right now is in New Jersey, but he normally can be found in Philadelphia. He is one of the world's leading experts on vaccination, inventor, co-inventor of the rotavirus, which children get. He's a professor of pediatrics, and he also runs the Vaccine Information Center at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia. And he's also the author of a new book, which has just come out. And we can do a little product placement here. There it is. And like all his other books, I'm sure it is a great read. So welcome, everyone. And especially Paul, who actually gave up being on CNN, on Aaron Burnett's show tonight, because he knows that we are more important than CNN. So, Paul, I mean, the obvious question to an expert in vaccine who has invented a vaccine: what is the prospect here for coming up with a vaccine? What is the realistic time frame and the realistic expectation?
All right, well, so first, the good news. There will be a vaccine. In fact, there will be vaccines. I don't think it's just going to be a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2. I think it's going to be a series of vaccines that are introduced both in this country and in the world. There are more than 70 companies that are interested in doing this. BARDA, which is part of Health and Human Services, has put forward $2.5 million, giving $500 million to each of 5 different companies that are largely U.S.-based. The virus is stable. So I don't think this is going to be like influenza, where it mutates so much from one year to the next that immunization doesn't protect you. Although it's a single-stranded RNA virus, it's more like measles, mumps, rubella. I don't think it's going to mutate away from the vaccine. You have the Food and Drug Administration has looked at more than 120 new investigational new drug licenses. So there's a lot of interest. There's a lot of money. You know the protein you're interested in. You're interested in making an antibody response to that spike protein on the surface of the virus, because that's the protein that's associated with virus cell binding. So if you can keep the virus from binding to cells, you're going to be able to keep it from infecting cells. So that's all good news. So there will be a vaccine. In terms of the timing, I think that's going to depend on how much uncertainty we're willing to live with before the vaccine rolls out to the public. I mean, typically vaccine programs are 20 years. I mean, our program was a 26-year program. That's about right. So there's a series of steps you go through. The last one of which was the most important is the so-called phase 3 trial, where you look at tens of thousands of people who either did, in this case, or didn't get the vaccine, to see whether it's safe and to see whether it's effective. Tens of thousands. I mean, our trial was a 70,000 person trial. The other rotavirus vaccine was a 60,000 person trial. I would be really surprised if the trials that were done for this vaccine were that big. My sense is that from what I've taught from the manufacturers I've talked to, the trials are going to be anywhere between 1,000 and 6,000 total people. So the biggest would be 3,000 on each side. That's not a lot. I mean, I think you can rule out common side effects with that kind of trial. I think you'd be lucky to have, depending on what the outbreak is like at the time, to have enough people in the placebo group to be comfortable about the efficacy. But on the other hand, you're dealing with a scourge. I mean, in the United States, 2,000 people are dying a day of this virus. And so I think you're willing to accept a greater level of uncertainty than you would if 2 people were dying a year from the virus. So we'll see how this plays out. The other thing is, I don't think this is going to be an FDA licensed product, which is true of every other vaccine since the FDA was formed. I think it's going to be an FDA approved product, which is not the same thing. It's going to be through the so-called Emergency Use Authorization Act, where the FDA will not be nearly as involved, I think, as they would be normally. I'm actually on the FDA's Vaccine Advisory Committee. I mean, any new vaccine comes through our committee. I don't think this vaccine is going to be coming through our committee. So that's how I see it playing out. There'll be a vaccine. I'm optimistic it'll be safe and effective. You could start to see people inoculated within a year, assuming that we're willing to accept some level of uncertainty, more uncertainty than we would for most vaccines.
Paul, in a very simple way, how does one go about developing a vaccine?
Right. So what the initial thing you'd like to do is something called a proof of concept study. So the best way to look at that is in animal models. So you'd like to have an animal model that at least somewhat reproduces the signs and symptoms that are seen with the infection. So in this case, you would inoculate an animal, a monkey, a mouse, a rat or a guinea pig, or a hamster with this virus, and then hopefully the animal would develop the same symptoms. Now that's good. Now you have a model to study. And so then you try your concept, whatever it is, a whole killed virus, a live attenuated virus like measles vaccine, a purified protein, whatever strategy you're using, and all strategies are currently on the table. And then you hopefully it works. You protect the animal with your vaccine against disease. That's good because now you can look very carefully at what specifically in the immune response is associated with protection. The kind of studies that are very difficult to do in people, you can do in animal models. Now you've got your proof of concept. Then what you do is you do sort of a dose ranging study where you in people you try and get a sense of just how much of that vaccine you need. You don't want to give too much because then it would be more of a safety problem. You don't want to give too little because then it's more of an efficacy problem. So you want to have the right dose. And that's usually done in hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. Then what you do is you progressively go through phase 1 and phase 2 studies, making sure that as you do bigger and bigger trials, that the vaccine is safe, and that it's consistently immunogenic, that it consistently induces the immune response you think is going to be associated with protection. And I want to emphasize you think is associated with the protection because you don't know that yet. You don't know that until you do a large efficacy trial. Then you go with the final big phase 3 trial, which in our case was a 70,000 baby, prospective, placebo-controlled, 11-country, 4-year, $350 million trial as a single trial that you then submit to the Food and Drug Administration, which takes on average about 10 months to review your product. If it's an expedited review, it takes 6 months. All of that takes on average about 20 years. So when you're talking about a 1.5 or 1 to 1.5 year timeline, you can assume correctly that steps are being skipped or at least coalesced. And I think what's happening here is that these companies are starting to manufacture this product as if it works, as if it's going to work. And then if it works, at least to the limited extent that they can determine whether it works, then it'll start rolling out. And I think the real answer to this is, I think what normally is done as a phase 3 trial will be done essentially post-approval. So the vaccine will roll out. It'll be given to healthcare workers. It'll be given to grocery store clerks, pharmacy clerks, mass transit people, critical industries like the meatpacking industry. And then, because not everybody's going to get it, tens of thousands will get it, tens of thousands won't get it. This after it rolls out, and then you'll really see exactly how safe it is and how effective it is, which essentially was happened with the Ebola vaccine. When the Ebola vaccine was waited for an outbreak in West Africa. When that outbreak occurred, Merck took that vaccine and then gave it to tens of thousands of people as quickly and efficiently as they could, but they couldn't vaccinate everybody. So they could tell by given who some were vaccinated, some weren't, whether it was safe and effective. And it was pretty much safe and definitely effective. And then years later, they licensed it. That vaccine was just licensed in 2019, the Ebola vaccine. So I kind of think it's going to be that model, if I had to make a guess.
Let me bring Ada in here because Ada had a bout with COVID and was positive. And I bet you would like to know whether or not now she's immune, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm not sure if there's been any new evidence coming out in the last couple of days about acquired immunity after infection or...
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, so that's the key thing. There were studies, so there are 4 human serotypes that have been circulating, no doubt, for centuries, but were first identified in the early 1960s, 4 different serotypes. And so there were studies done years ago where what they did was they took experimental challenge studies in people, and they would inoculate them with one of the serotypes, and then they would challenge them a year later with one or the other of the serotypes. And what they found was that if you were inoculated with one serotype, 1 year later, you were relatively protected against that serotype 1 year later. Now, they never did studies beyond that year. As a general rule, when you have these kinds of viruses, which is to say viruses that only reproduce themselves at the site of entry, where viremia or spread of virus into the bloodstream is not an important part of the disease process, as a general rule, immunity tends to be relatively short-lived, meaning years, not decades, and relatively incomplete, meaning protection against moderate to severe disease, but not necessarily asymptomatic disease associated with reinfection or mildly symptomatic disease, but that's okay. That was true with the rotavirus vaccine as well. I mean, our vaccine protects against moderate to severe disease. Our vaccine keeps children out of the hospital and keeps children out of the morgue. And I think that's what the goal is for this vaccine too, to do that. And so we'll see. We'll see. It's an unusual virus. I mean, it's a bat virus. It's just made its debut in the human population, so we're learning as we go.
Jonathan has been looking into mutations. So, any question for Paul about what you found?
Nothing that comes off the top of my head. I mean, as he just mentioned, the virus does appear to be relatively stable from a genetic point of view in terms of mutations, which is good news, because if it were a virus that would mutate quite a bit, you would think, well, maybe it's going to end up with a mutation that codes for one of the spike proteins, and then any kind of vaccine that is targeting those might no longer work. But if it is stable, then we don't have that issue, which is reassuring.
Emily, there's a question there.
Yeah, just on there's a couple on the subject of vaccines. One that we actually got a question from Twitter. If there are many strains of COVID-19, thousands by one measure, how much protection could we actually expect from a vaccine?
No, I mean, it's a single stranded RNA virus. Actually, I've just gotten dark. Do you notice it? How am really dark?
Yeah.
You may turn on lights. Would that help?
I think you should, yes, if you can.
All right. I'll answer this question, then I'll go turn on light, because it looks like I'm like one of the characters in Saw 3. So, it's a single-stranded RNA virus. So as all true in all single-stranded RNA viruses, there's mutations, roughly one mutation per sort of cycle of replication per 7,500 base pairs. That's expected. Measles is the same. Measles, mumps, rubella, those are all single-stranded RNA viruses, but those are single serotype viruses. So I don't think, I mean, it depends. You just want to make sure that the strains, although there are going to be sequence differences, that those aren't really functionally important, that there aren't critical clinical differences, that there aren't critical differences, most importantly in regard to serotype, that you don't drift away from this base serotype, which is what was said earlier. So I don't think that's going to happen. And now, while I've answered that question, I'm going to go to the lights. So
and I'll take you off. So when you get up,
turn on the lights.
We do have another question.
When he comes back, maybe he can define serotype, because I'm not sure that it's been properly defined, just so that we're all on the same page.
Okay.
Sure.
Well, let's
let there be light. Oh, that's a start.
Let there be light.
There we go. It's a little bit better now.
That's better.
All right.
Okay, Paul, maybe just to pick on what you were talking about, define what is meant by serotype.
Sure. So a serotype is a type. So in other words, viruses can be distinguished one for another by antibodies in the serum. So, for example, poliovirus has 3 different serotypes, and therefore all 3 serotypes need to be contained in the vaccine. The human papillomavirus has 30 serotypes, but 9 prevalent ones are contained in the vaccine. So if I'm inoculated with polio serotype 1, I will develop antibodies in my serum that neutralize serotype 1, but don't neutralize serotype 2 and 3, which is to say those 3 viruses are serotypically distinct or distinguishable by neutralizing antibodies in serum.
What is the chemical difference between the serotypes?
So often just differences in the in the protein that sits on the surface, the cell attachment protein. It's true for all viruses. It's always based on differences in cell attachment protein.
Well, a question that has come up repeatedly over the last couple of weeks, I guess because there was a paper published in Japan about inhaling the fumes of sake and killing the virus in your throat with inhaled ethanol. And this has unleashed all kinds of questions. Now, to me, it's just innately obvious that this is not going to work, but I'm not exactly sure why. So suppose someone has been infected and the virus is in the mucous membranes of your throat. Can there possibly be any benefit inhaling hot alcohol vapors?
No. And here's why. I mean, viruses aren't bacteria. They reproduce themselves not outside of cells, but inside of cells. So you wouldn't be able to kill the virus unless you were willing to kill the cell, or said another way, unless you were willing to kill you.
Right. But is the virus on the outside of the cell before it invades the cell, labile to alcohol?
Well, again, it would have to be undiluted. But you remember, the minute that you inhale or drink or whatever, you're going to be diluting it with your own secretion. So I think that would dramatically lower the percentage alcohol. And viruses for the most part quickly go inside cells. They attach and enter cells very quickly. So there's, when they travel, they go cell to cell. They usually, that they one cell to the next cell to the next cell. So it would be hard to kill them with something like that. Now, disinfectants, that's a completely different story. No, just kidding. That was
So
well, we have heard about this, right? Inhaling the disinfectants and flooding the body with light. And, actually, interestingly enough, after I heard this, bizarre comment from your president about the disinfectants and treatment with light, so I start looking into it, where he could have heard something about this light business. And there actually are companies that are making products that through fiber optics can be put into the bronchi, and supposedly with UVA, they do something to the virus. I think it's a lot of fun. But as I was searching through this, I also came upon papers from the 1940s and the 1950s, where in order to treat polio, to treat septicemia, they would draw blood from the patient, only about 7% of the total volume of the blood in the patient, pass it through a chamber, expose it to UV, and re-infuse it into the patient. And they had a number of papers where they claimed success about this. Well, have you ever heard of this?
So UV light causes thymidine dimers, and for viruses, the virus gene then is not able to be transcribed. Or said another way, the virus isn't able to reproduce itself. So it's not. Certainly, it is true that if you have a virus on a surface and you expose it to UV light, that's going to kill the virus. That's why when you work with viruses in a laboratory, in a laminar flow hood, when you're done, you flip on the UV light when you leave, because you want that UV light to kill any virus that may have gotten onto a surface. Obviously, it's much harder in a person because, the virus, it goes in cells. Polio, has viremia as part of pathogenesis. So you would, in theory, be able to take out blood. You maybe would be able to find virus in the bloodstream that you then could, in theory, affect. But here, obviously, this is not that virus. Viremia is not part of part of spread here, so that wouldn't work. Chewable Clorox is a completely different story, though. Just kidding.
we have some good.
Chewable Clorox does not work, and chewable Clorox does not exist.
We have some good questions here. Still some about a lot about the vaccines. But someone says, what would be considered a good efficacy rate? 60%? And also something about nitric oxide inhalation, that there was perhaps some evidence for that.
I think in terms of efficacy rate, so the current influenza vaccine has an efficacy of about 50%, roughly. It's 50% effective at preventing moderate to severe disease. But, this is a virus that causes 25 to 30 million cases in the United States every year, causes up to 700,000 hospitalizations every year, and kills 40 or 50, and this year expected as many as 60,000 people every year. So if you have a vaccine that's 50% effective and prevents half of that, that's still a tremendous impact. I think you could probably make the same case here. If this virus was still the scourge that it is now, you would be willing to I think, have a 50 or 60% efficacy to prevent that disease. You would. Look at how excited people were about remdesivir, which, if you look at those data, I don't know if you saw that came out yesterday, the antiviral remdesivir. Is that something you guys saw? But
has the data come out, or was this just a press release?
So it was a press release from the NIH, though. So it gives you some information. But no, you're right. It's not a published paper yet. The sense is that it was a 1,036-person study. Both groups were divided in half. 500 people got placebo, 500 got remdesivir. These were patients admitted to the hospital with SARS-CoV-2, who were then in one or the other group. What they found was that those who were treated with the remdesivir had a length of illness of 11 days. Those who were treated with placebo, if you will, had a length of illness of 15 days. So it was roughly 30% decrease in the length of time that you were infected. It didn't really, in any statistically significant way, prevent you from progressing to death. You still were as likely to die if you were treated if you weren't. And I haven't seen the data yet, which gets to your point. I mean, did it prevent you from going to the ICU? Did it prevent you from being ventilated and admitted to the ICU? Haven't seen those data. Since it didn't prevent death, I'm not sure it prevented that either, which is really what you want. The problem is, though, by the time you get to the hospital, the way it works is that initially the virus reproduces itself again and again early in illness. Then what happens is you develop an immune response, i.e. you develop symptoms. Viral replication becomes a less important part of pathogenesis. There was just a paper out of China showing that patients who were in the ICU, who were treated with remdesivir versus those who weren't, were not more or less likely to die. So it didn't work because it's too late. So the trick is really getting people early on in the cycle, which may happen. I think, remdesivir was given intravenously to these patients. There is an oral form of the drug. And I think that may be the way this ends up playing out. People will try and treat themselves early with the oral form of the drug. I think that may be what happens, in which case I think it would make more of a difference.
What about the nitric oxide?
Yeah, I don't know anything about that. I again am always suspicious of any sort of surface treatment. I like I like treatments that actually have to do with like viral replication. I mean, like remdesivir is a RNA-dependent RNA polymerase inhibitor, so therefore it prevents the virus from reproducing itself. Clearly, at least there's a biological basis for that, or protease inhibitors. The virus has a protease. I mean, there at least.
I think the argument with nitric oxide is the same as with Viagra, that it opens up blood vessels and that it might open up the bronchi and ease breathing. I think that's the argument.
A supportive therapy, not an antiviral therapy.
Supportive therapy.
So
yeah.
Maybe we could just switch because lots of things are happening here in Quebec over the next few weeks, and our very own Dr. Debbie wants to know Dr. Offit's take on children as vectors and herd immunity.
I'm guessing Dr. Debbie is related to Joe.
Yes, she is. And she's been on here with us every other week, but she's now been replaced by you.
All the Schwartz doctors are only first name. That's the way it works.
Well, Debbie has 3 small kids,
yeah.
So of course she's very concerned about what to do when they are supposed to go back to school. So are children vectors?
I think the answer is yes. I think children, they certainly shed virus. There's no reason to believe they wouldn't be vectors. And they shed a fair amount of virus. So I think even asymptomatically, they may be vectors, yes. And there was a second part of that, Emily? The second part to that question?
Yeah, it was herd immunity.
Yeah, so I think, so Sweden sort of makes the big bet, right? They figure we'll take a more laissez-faire attitude with this virus. We'll let more people get infected. Therefore, we'll develop population immunity based on the fact that most people have been infected, or a critical number of people have been infected, and that way the virus will spread less. That's a bad idea as a general rule. I think the only way really to develop true population immunity is with a vaccine. I mean, as a child of the 50s, I had measles. That gave me, that protected me for the rest of my life. That infection protected me for the rest of my life. This was true of everybody who got measles. Yet every year there was enough susceptible people in the population that 2 to 3 million people in our country got measles every year. 50,000 would be hospitalized and 500 would die. I think you'd always have a critical number of susceptibles. And even, the 4 human strains of coronavirus circulate every year in our country, account for about 15 to 20% of the respiratory illnesses that come into our hospital every winter, and nobody seems to be immune for that long. So I don't think it would work.
So here kids are supposed to go back elementary school May 19th. That's so far, although that decision may be reversed. What do you think? Is that a reasonable thing to do?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I think we never needed to close schools. The CDC never had a recommendation to close schools in the United States. People did it because they got scared. I mean, children generally are healthy children do not die from this infection. And I think, so what ended up happening? Kids stayed home, hung out with their grandparents. I'm not sure this was necessarily a great idea. Singapore never closed schools early on and still were able to get on top of this infection to some extent. I think they closed schools later, but early on, I think the CDC was right. I don't think that had a big impact on the epidemiology. So I don't think you needed to close schools. Am I okay with people going back to school in May 19th in Quebec? Sure.
Okay, well, Debbie has her answer now.
Yeah.
My grandchildren go back to school. Okay, there are all kinds of novel ideas out there. And one that came out this week was Pepcid, the gastrointestinal remedy, because of this observation in China that older people who were taking Pepcid afflicted by the virus were less likely to die than ones who were taking Prilosec, which is a more expensive drug. And in New York, they're actually now running a trial on Pepcid. And when I first heard about this, I started to roll my eyes until you start looking into it. And it turns out actually that with the computer modeling studies, famotidine, which is the active ingredient in Pepcid, actually was listed as number 3 as a possible candidate for latching on to the spike virus. So what do you think of this, of the computer modeling, coming up with drugs which already exist so that you don't have to go through trials, and doing the molecular structure modeling to see which fits the spike protein?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting theory. Again, like all interesting theories, I think it should be subjected to study. So, I mean, it's not hard to do a prospective placebo-controlled trial with Pepcid in patients who were infected early on. Would love to see those data. I mean, what ends up happening is the same thing happened with hydroxychloroquine. You had a physician in France, this Didier Raoult, if that's how you pronounce his last name, who pushed this, all based on anecdotal data. I mean, there was no control trial. Now that we do a control trial, you find that it doesn't work. And in fact, because it causes cardiac toxicity, makes you worse. So again, I think this is a relatively benign therapy. So it would be interesting to see prospectively whether it matters. And then you really can say something about this.
Yeah. Well, they're doing this in a number of hospitals in New York now, so it looks like it's a very good trial. It's placebo-controlled, and we'll see in a few weeks. Good. Let me ask Ada a question here, because we were talking about young children going back to school, and now at McGill we're talking about opening up the research labs possibly next week. Are you going to feel comfortable going into the lab?
I'm very interested in where you got that next week figure from, because that has not been shared with the grad students. So,
well, you can take it from me.
I would feel comfortable, but that's largely because I had it already, so there's a very good chance, all expectations, that I have immunity. And as well, our lab space is quite large, so there's a lot of space where if we work in shifts, and I know that my PI has talked about we'll make a shift schedule, I feel fine doing that, but not every lab is set up with the capability to have people working in different sections at different times. And I'm hoping that they'll be quite gracious with, I'm pretty healthy as a grad student, but there are immunocompromised grad students and professors and teaching assistants that may not be going back, and I don't think should be penalized because of that.
No, I don't think there's going to be any penalties. I think it's going to be quite voluntary, and it's going to be controlled. Probably not allowed more than 2 students in a lab at a time. Mm-hmm. It'll be that kind of stuff.
I mean, it'll be very nice to get back to research, especially because my quarantine has essentially been about 6 weeks longer than everyone else's with the knee surgery. So,
right. Okay, Emily, let's get back to questions.
So, Emily, who's that guy?
Did you see him? I'm trying to fix my audio because something's wrong with my microphone, but I hope people can hear me. I'm trying to.
Yeah.
What?
I hear you.
That was my husband. Yeah.
Hey. Congratulations.
Yes, thank you. Thank you we got married before the pandemic hit, so we were kind of lucky. This is a very interesting question and kind of a morbid question, but she did preface it with this is controversial. So some people state that the pandemic is a way of nature trying to cleanse itself of an overpopulation of Homo sapiens. So what would your view be on that?
This sort of Malthusian view, that it's like the forest fire. Just clean out the old stuff so that the new growth can come in, right? I don't know. It's interesting that we periodically suffer pandemics. I mean, roughly 3 times a century we suffer an influenza pandemic. Often they come from where you're seeing this one come from, in Southeast Asia, because there's a very close association between a variety of different animals. So in the world of flu, you have, for example, pigs, next to humans, next to birds, and the pigs sort of serve as a genetic reassortment laboratory for these, because the pig has cells that bind both human flu viruses and bird flu viruses, and therefore can create that reassortment that then can be released to the world. I don't know why nature does that, but it is true that there's a book called Spillover that goes through just the fact that many of the viruses and pathogens that we deal with come from animals initially in our close association with animals. Was AIDS put on this earth to try and thin out the herd? You had the AIDS probably, no doubt, came from simian immunodeficiency virus. Probably it evolved in Cameroon in the 1930s when a hunter, cut a monkey, killed it, and then inadvertently inoculated simian immunodeficiency virus into himself, and that ultimately mutated to human immunodeficiency virus. At least that's as far back as we can trace it. Why does that happen? I don't know if there's a grander plan other than just a lot of messy viruses that come out and occasionally try and kill us.
Yeah, it really depends on what your beliefs are. I see no reason to ascribe consciousness to nature. These are just things that happen. The universe is not trying to kill us. The universe just doesn't care, unfortunately.
It is interesting, though. You say that this virus arises thanks to our relationship with animals, but it does. A lot of these viruses, and if you look at even non-viral illnesses like mad cow disease that came out of Britain, a lot of these issues are arising from kind of treating animals poorly. If we weren't feeding ground up cow to other cows, we may never have developed mad cow. And if we weren't keeping wild animals in wet markets in such close proximity and, squalid conditions, they likely wouldn't be as sick and therefore likely couldn't pass it on to us. So there is something interesting to look at the way that we treat animals and the consequences that's having on humanity, I think.
Yeah, that's a very solid argument, and a lot of people, of course, are making that. And there are a lot of dedicated vegans now who say, well, if everyone were going vegan, we wouldn't have so many of these problems.
Yeah, China has a taste for bats. They drink bat tea, they drink bat soup, they eat fried bats. So,
now the president is trying to deflect blame by saying that it should all be directed towards China because they weren't forthcoming early enough with information. How much truth do you think there is to that? And if China really would have been more forthcoming, could the tragedy in the U.S. have been reduced?
It's certainly true that China was not a good neighbor here. You shouldn't have had to have depended on a whistleblower in Wuhan to tell you that there was a virus that was circulating in the community that was killing people. That shouldn't have been the whistleblower that told you that. And I think the World Health Organization, needs to have, I guess, a greater reign, if you will, on countries to make sure that the minute these things happen, that what's going on. That said, our president is in the business of distracting and dividing. That's his main goal. So he is always looking to blame something on somebody else. Look at what he did. There was a pandemic preparedness program that was put in place in this country in 2005 associated with the emergence of H5N1 bird flu virus that was put in place by Tony Fauci. That was pretty much dissembled by our president. He was very early on. He clearly had intelligence briefings that said, stop flights in from China into this country. He was slow to do that. Once the virus got here, he did everything he could to deny it. We're on top of this. Don't worry, a few cases. Don't worry about it. Don't do anything different. Then there started to be community spread. Nancy Messonnier, who's the head of the National Center for Immunization and Respiratory Disease, she was head of the coronavirus task force at the CDC. She said it's not a matter of whether it gets here. It's only a matter of when. And she said that the market dropped 1,000 points, and she basically was taken off the case because the administration didn't like her saying that. And what she said was exactly right. Then it starts to spread in the community. What do you need to do? You need to get testing out there. We still don't have testing out there. We still do 200,000 tests a day when we should be doing 5 million tests a day. Germany's the better model for this. So we don't have testing. We don't have adequate testing. We were very slow to lock down in some areas. And so we have 60,000 deaths. We have more deaths than any other country. And so Donald Trump is never, ever going to take blame for things. That's not who he is. He is in the distraction business. And so he was very quick to use the term foreign Chinese virus so that he could sort of get people into his kind of, let's blame this on let's get the xenophobes out there. I mean, this is how he ran his entire election, right? But the fear of people coming up from the South, rapists and murderers coming up from the South, invading us and taking our jobs. This is him. It's pathetic. It is pathetic. And the most pathetic part of all this is that the Republicans let him get away with it. They are his enablers. I mean, he is always who he's been.
Do you think that when he made the notorious remark, 15 cases today, probably 0 by tomorrow, at that time, of course, he knew the truth, right? I mean, his advisors had told him what was happening. Do you think at that time, if he would have started up the distancing and the social distancing, would the country have accepted that, given the fact that, at that time there were very few cases, even though it was clear that there was going to be more? But even if he had suggested, let's start the social distancing, would it have happened?
I think if the right person delivered the message, yes. I think he should have stood back and had people like, Tony Fauci and Nancy Messonnier and others who then could form a committee to advise exactly how to move forward on this, and then put it forward as a cogent, clear plan as to how we're going to do this. Because look at what's happening in this country, in this country, in this country. It's coming. It's not hard to scare people. We've certainly scared people. And I just think the right person delivering the message would have done. I mean, South Korea had done 200,000 tests by the time we'd done 500. I mean, there's no reason that either scientifically or economically we couldn't match what was going on in South Korea. We just were really, really slow to react because Donald Trump wanted to wish it away. Frankly, the only way he got involved in this was when the stock market started to collapse. Then he was in. I mean, then he realized, because frankly, it's always about Donald Trump. It's about Donald Trump making money. The leisure industry suffering, the entertainment industry suffering, the gambling industry suffering. This affects him. And so now he's interested. And so then he quickly looks for the magic cure. Hydroxychloroquine is going to be the greatest medical breakthrough in history, right? Because he wants it to go away. We're going to have a vaccine in 2 months, is what he initially said. I mean, he just wants it to go away however it goes away. We're going to have people use disinfectants. We're going to have them UV light, whatever it is. He just wants to figure out, can we make this go away now? He's just...
And before November.
Well, yeah.
Right.
Well, no, actually what happened, if you really want to be depressed, I mean, so we have how many people? About 25 million people now that apply for insurance, unemployment insurance. Half of those people are now making more a week than they did before.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think with the opening up of Georgia and the 7 or 8 other states that are going to do today? What do you think is going to happen? What will we see?
Yeah, so it's going to be a grand national experiment. In a better world, we do what Germany did, which was you look at population density, you look at spread based on testing, and then you let Harrisburg go back to work before you let Philadelphia go back to work, right? Because we have more dense population, we have more spread in our population, and so that would be the smart way to do it. We're not doing that at all because we're not doing testing, and we're never going to do testing. Forget it. Forget testing. It's not going to happen. So I think what you'll see is you'll have a grand national experiment. You'll look at areas that were more or less dense, areas where there was more or less spread of virus in Georgia, in South Carolina, in Florida, in Texas, in Iowa. I mean, you'll see. It's interesting. A lot of these governors are sort of pushing people back to work because they don't want to pay unemployment insurance. That's really the main motivator for them. You're Iowa, right? You're going back to work. I don't want to hear anything from you. And then so Tyson Foods basically gets, which is in Iowa, gets basically coverage from liability because Trump's trying to cover them. It's really sloppy. It's really messy. We'll learn a lot. We'll definitely learn a lot from this. In 2 years from now, we're going to look back on this and we're going to say, here's what we should have done. Here's what we didn't need to do because we are about to face phase 2 of a massive public health disaster. I mean, phase 1 was, suffering, hospitalization, death. Phase 2, massive joblessness, which will lead to massive homelessness and all the attendant consequences of massive homelessness, food insecurity, depression, domestic violence, child abuse, etc. That's going to happen, and that's phase 2. And if we had a leader who could actually articulate how we can smartly get back to work, we wouldn't have to face this awful phase 2. But we are going to reach the level like in 1929 with the Great Depression. It's going to be awful. People think they're just going back to work. A lot of businesses are closed. They couldn't make it. They're not going to make it.
Okay. Well, yeah, there's a bunch here I want to get to before we finish for sure. This person asked it twice, which means she's very concerned, and this person is my mother. So I am going to say it.
Well, by the way, I have met your mother.
You have met my mother, yes. A doctor also, and she's still treating patients. So should we be concerned about limited materials to produce the vaccine as being a limited factor for mass production? Reagents, et cetera, stuff like that.
I think there's going to be many vaccines, frankly. And I think if there's very early on, we learned that one is outstanding. I think you will have an enormous pull mechanism from the government to recruit many, either through this sort of defense, what's called Defense Appropriation Act, whatever it is, or Defense Procurement Act, that to basically make it so that these companies then mass produce. I mean, I'm on a group that's headed by Francis Collins, who's the head of National Institutes of Health, called ACTIV. I don't know if you read about it, ACTIV, which stands for Accelerating COVID-19 Technological Innovations and Vaccines. So we have, on the call are CDC representatives, FDA, academics, and members of the industry. And so the goal is to try and move things forward as fast as possible. What Francis Collins said on our first call was, we need to make 1 billion doses. So I think if that's the goal, obviously it's not going to be all made at once. I think there'll be an enormous pull mechanism if there's a clear winner or winners to get that vaccine out. So I don't think, as always, we're not going to make it all at once. But I think if it's clear and this virus continues to be a scourge, I think production won't be that big of a problem.
This is another good one for you. What determines why some vaccines require multiple shots, like Gardasil? 3 shots over a course of months or years. Do you have any idea how many a vaccine for COVID would require?
So when you have live attenuated viral vaccines, usually you can get away with 1 or 2 inoculations. When you kill a virus and it's not reproducing itself, then you need to give more inoculations, like inactivated polio vaccine or hepatitis A vaccine. When you just take parts of a virus or parts of a bacteria, you're not obviously getting as big of a drive to the immune response as when you're inoculated with either wild type virus or with with an attenuated virus. So that's why. But there was a second part to that question, Emily, which was?
No.
Do you have any idea of how many doses will be required for a COVID-19 vaccine?
Well, the trials. So the Moderna has a messenger RNA vaccine, which is currently a 2-dose vaccine. The same thing with Inovio's DNA vaccine is a 2-dose vaccine. So the initial trials are 2 doses.
Paul, one concern that I would have is, once the vaccine, let's say it works, starts to be produced, obviously there's going to be a limited amount available. Who is going to make the decision on who gets the vaccine and who doesn't?
Well, hopefully the CDC. Which is traditionally what is their role. So they I think would say, okay, here's phase 1, right? Healthcare responder. Here's phase 2, grocery store, pharmacy, whatever. Here's phase 3. Here's phase 4. I think in order to do it in an orderly manner. Otherwise, you sort of have that scene that you had like at the end of Contagion, where everybody storms the gates and tries to get a vaccine because they know it's the only way they can save their lives. Which actually I think was done as a lottery, actually, in the that thing. It's funny, the anti-vaccine people who email me constantly, by the way, their question is always the same. Are you going to mandate this vaccine? Are you going to mandate this vaccine? Are you going to mandate this vaccine? I think a lottery may be more what happens here than a mandate. It depends on how.
It's fascinating that anti-vax people
I was going to ask
still
that.
not giving up. They're not giving up on their philosophy, even though they are seeing now what a world without a vaccine looks like. And yet they still don't trust vaccines. This is pathological thinking.
Well, some of them believe that this whole COVID thing was created by the pharmaceutical industry to sell us a vaccine, right? So there are always ways of using motivated reasoning to get to your conclusion.
It's totally exhausting. Let's switch to face masks for a second, because again, as things are starting to open up here, there's talk about mandatory face masks, or not everyone will be wearing one. And why is there such resistance to wearing a face mask during a respiratory pandemic in some places, or with some people, and then other states like New York and Massachusetts, it's mandatory now when you go out, and here it's not.
No, I think face masks are a good idea. I mean, do I think face masks make for less spread? Yes. I mean, there was a study done in our hospital that clearly showed that. So I think face masks are a good idea. If you're going to make them mandatory, now you're sort of gradually moving into like police state territory. So if there was a video that went viral in Philadelphia where a guy was on a SEPTA bus and who didn't have a face mask on, and they asked him to get off and he refused. And so the police came and pulled him off and threw him against the side of the bus and put his hands behind him. That's not what you want. I think if we're going to make face masks mandatory, then make them really available. People that you have them at all the sites where you want them to be. Then make sure you have an abundance of face masks that you can give to people and ask them to wear them. But I think face masks are a good idea.
Masks here, at least according to the popular press, is that you're wearing a mask to protect others, not yourself, right? Why is that the case? I mean, why would wearing a mask not offer any protection to the wearer?
Well, I think it does both. I mean, frankly, what worries me about face masks is when people let's say they have a mild respiratory infection, they think, okay, well, I'll wear the face mask and now I won't spread the virus. Wrong. I mean, those sort of rectangular surgical face masks, as you notice, you can breathe in and out of the side of them. You can certainly transmit that virus to others. Also, if you have it on for a while, it starts to get wet and more porous. So I that's the downside of a face mask, because you think you're protecting others when you may not be.
I have a question here that really is probably on all grandparents' minds. When will it be safe to hug my grandchildren? And when will it be safe to have a normal physical relationship, such as dating? I mean, is that like people are now have to wait for a vaccine to hug their grandchildren or to go on dates?
If we're waiting for a vaccine, I mean, it is amazing, isn't it? Tony Fauci gets up there and says we're not going to have any large crowd sporting events until there's a vaccine. Good Lord. I mean, talk about pressure to make a vaccine. When we made our vaccine, we were trying to save 2,000 lives a day, but we weren't trying to save professional sports, which, is even harder. But I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I think what's going to happen over time is we'll gradually get more and more comfortable doing those things. But for right now, the reason people are so scared is twofold. One, there's asymptomatic shedding. I mean, so everybody therefore is a possible person who could kill you, and the virus is transmitted to some extent on surfaces. I think that is true, and so hence hand washing becomes important. So that is true. I mean, I even think there may be a fecal oral component to this virus. I mean, certainly live virus has been detected in intestines. There are people who have vomiting and diarrhea as part of this illness, and also it does sound like norovirus, doesn't? I mean, cruise ships, nursing homes, that's sort of a norovirus story. So I do think surfaces are part of this. So therefore, everything's in play, right? Surfaces, an asymptomatic person, and that's why people are so scared. It reminds me a lot of the early days of AIDS. In the early 1980s, nobody knew what caused AIDS and nobody knew how you got it. And so people were scared to pick up a piece of fruit in the grocery store.
So, Paul, let me ask you this. Suppose the NFL does come back in the fall. Will you go to an Eagles game?
Paul, who is you are a diehard Eagles fan. Let's just put that out there.
Ticket holder, I'd like to point out, yes.
Yes.
So I do have season tickets to the Eagles game, which, by the way, Joe, if you're ever around, you're welcome to come to these games, assuming either of us live through this. What I would say is, I think that...
Will you go? Oh,
yes.
Are you going to?
I'm going to answer that question. I think that it depends where we are in September. I imagine I won't be going, I think. I still think that the virus will be circulating. I think that a large crowd like that is a risk. Just looking around the people that typically goes to those games, I think it's even a greater risk. Just the drinking alone. But were there a vaccine, I might feel a little differently. But until, I'm not waiting for a vaccine, but I'm waiting till it's clear that we've gotten way past the hump of this, and we're not there yet.
So
we'll see.
I know that we're going to probably be wrapping up soon, but I feel this is a good one to ask because, again, someone asked it twice, and this person is not my mother. Just looking at our mission of separating sense from nonsense, that this person says there seems to be a lot of conflicting evidence out there, even from somewhere such as the Stanford study, showing that the death rate of COVID is actually quite low, sometimes even lower than the flu. And the government is totally overreacting, and the conflicting information actually makes it difficult to know what to believe. So can you please provide the actual death rate, and is the virus as serious as what we are being told?
Well, but it's certainly serious. I mean, when 2,000 people are dying a day, you can assume it's serious. The death rate initially was reported by the World Health Organization. The mortality rate was 3.5%. That was wrong because you didn't really know the denominator. I mean, as we do more and more serological studies and you understand really who was infected asymptomatically, which you wouldn't have known normally because you're not testing those people, the mortality rate has come down again and again and again. I mean, the latest mortality figure I saw out of our country was 0.15%. For Germany, for Iceland, it's similar to that, sort of 0.38%, 0.4%. So it's definitely lower than you thought. And this was true with remember the 2009-2010 swine flu pandemic in the United States. The original mortality rates were listed as 4%. When people did serological studies and saw what the actual denominator was, it went down to 0.01%. So I do think it's if you're an older person and you have certain comorbidities like high blood pressure or type 2 diabetes or obesity, you have a 15% chance of dying if you're infected with this virus. As distinct from if you're a healthy, less than 18-year-old, it's less than 0.1%.
Now, what about the younger people? I mean, there are a lot of younger people in hospitals also. Do they have mostly comorbidities?
Meaning the people who come into the hospital or people who take care of people in the hospital?
Under 50s who are suffering from COVID and who don't do very well. Is it because they also have comorbidities?
Often that's true. But I think they tend not to die. I mean, they go to the ICU, they get ventilated, and they tend not to die, whereas the older person dies. But yes, I think that there is an increased incidence of comorbidities in that younger person. Yes. But you don't see, the thing is like, for example, hospital employees, and somebody who works in the intensive care unit, somebody who works in the emergency department, when they're exposed, they're often exposed to a larger quantity of virus because they're closer to that person and they're being exposed more frequently. And the larger quantity of virus, I think, makes them more susceptible to serious disease.
Okay, I'm going to finally put you on the spot.
Okay.
If you were the president, I mean, of course, the world would be a lot better off, that's for sure, than with this president. Of course, the world would be better off with anyone other than this president. Okay, but suppose that you were in that position. What were the let's say, the three things that you would do?
First thing I would do, fire the Attorney General. Okay, just so we're clear. So the principal law enforcement agent in the land actually enforces the law. That's number one. Now, what would I do? At this point, it's a little late in the game. What you really would have wanted to do is what Angela Merkel does, which is, do 5 million tests a day and then start to gradually bring people back into the workplace. I think it's too late for that. I think people are just going back to the workplace now, willy-nilly, without the information that you really need. I guess I would try and do the best I could to do testing that I thought was in the most vulnerable areas. So in Iowa, for example, where the governor's basically saying, go back to work, I don't want to hear from you, stop whining, I would go to the big cities and see the denser cities and see what the attack rate was to say, okay, these areas of Iowa can go back and these areas can't, and try and do it that way. Then I would fire the Attorney General.
What about masks?
I think I would, at least for the moment, try and insist on masks. I think that the masks work. And at the very least, it reminds you to sort of steer clear of people and try and maintain some social distancing. I think masks do work, but I wouldn't do it in a police state kind of way. I would just make masks abundantly available if you're going to ask people to do them. Yes, I would.
What is your best guess for getting back to anything near normalcy?
I think this virus probably won't do well in the summer here. I mean, it's an envelope virus. As a general rule, the viruses don't do well in the heat. Also, usually when you have a virus that's transmitted by small droplets, as it gets more humid, those droplets secrete water more, acquire water more, and drop more quickly, so you're less transmissible. That's why, at least it's thought that influenza is a winter, not summer virus. So I think we'll do better in the summer. And then the question is it going to be a false sense of security, or will this virus then reemerge again in the winter? Because generally human coronaviruses are winter viruses. We'll see whether this acts like the human coronaviruses, and then we'll know. And if it comes roaring back again in September and October, it's going to be rough, because then it's going to be happening at the same time as flu, whereas flu sort of what happened much earlier than this virus sort of came in our country. We didn't really start to see deaths till March, when flu season was already starting to come down.
So basically, our world is going to be changing for a long time.
I definitely think so. I think people will shake hands less. I think that they may hug less. I think that now suddenly you see just a normal person on the street as being a potential person who could kill you. I think we see each other differently now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we've kept you a bit longer than we were planning to, but really it's been great. We thank you for giving up Erin Burnett for us. Although Erin would not have given you 45 minutes.
No, she would. She would.
We're better at getting the message out. So thanks a lot. And I mean, your views are always welcome. They're thoughtful. There's a lot of wisdom there. Yeah. And because, we live in this world where we try to separate sense from nonsense, we see so much of the nonsense side that it's so comforting to see some sense. So, Paul, thanks very much for being with us. And your new book, once more, it's called...
Here it is. So you can get it in bookstores everywhere, assuming you can find a bookstore open on the planet. It's called Overkill When Modern Medicine Goes Too Far, which seems curiously apt right now.
Wear your mask when you go into the bookstore. Right?
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, well,
all right, take care. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
All our viewers, of course, you can still keep sending us questions. All our emails, you can send questions. And this program, of course, is recorded, so it can be viewed at any time. So thanks again for being with us. We will do this again next week. And I'm sure by that time we will have a lot of new information about just what is happening in this strange world of the COVID infection.
Thank you. Bye.